Hello, and welcome to the Full of Ship podcast. Real answers to real problems. With your host, Kyle Henderson, CEO and co-founder of Vision, a podcast dedicated to demystify the chaotic, often turbulent world of ocean freight. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Welcome to another episode of Full of Ship. I'm your host, Kyle Henderson, and today our guest is CEO of Unity SCM, Amir Taichman. Welcome, Amir.
Hi, Casey. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure to have you on the podcast today. I want to get rolling right into our conversation, but typically we like to start with a little background before getting into the meat of the chat. I understand that your company's priorities have been evolving over the last few years, and that Unity SCM is, well, maybe I'll let you tell yourself. What's the background of Unity SCM and how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, happy to share. Thank you. So the purpose of Unity SCM is really, we like saying it's to make it easy for companies to collect data from their entire supply chain, automatically organize it, and make it also really, really easy to consume it to drive more data-driven supply chain operations. And the context for it is that, before starting Unity, almost 7 years ago, I joined a company, and my background is in data platforms, search, web search data, location services data, security data. And I got recruited to a product leadership position by a company in the supply chain visibility space. And we worked with many of the Fortune 100 companies, and for me, as someone who didn't come from the supply chain space, it was kind of shocking how much money these companies spend on their supply chain IT software. But at the same time, when you sit down with what I like calling the people who actually do the work, the supply planners, the logistics managers, their days all look exactly the same. They come in the morning, they get 12 different spreadsheets, reports from the ERP, from the TMS, other three-letter acronym curses, from their business partners, carriers, you name it. And then they spent a lot of time just trying to consolidate all of that information into something actionable before they even start kind of doing their job. And it was very clear to me, coming from other spaces where data is a big, driver of business, that there's better ways to do it. And one of the things that occurred to us is that there's so many companies focused on what you do with the data once you have it. But in reality, when we started Unity, almost no one that's focused on how do you actually get the data in the hands of people? How do you make sure that it's with quality, that someone can actually, look at information and just start using it? And so what we figured out is, let's take everything we know about data platforms from other industries and just apply it to supply chain. And obviously, we found out it's a much harder problem, much more complicated, much more fragmented. But at the basis of it, the mission hasn't changed, right? Just make it really, really easy for companies to consume data from anywhere where it might be, and anyone who's producing it, internal, external, solve that.
You mentioned when we started Unity SCM. How long ago was that?
So we started Unity SCM at the beginning of 2020, just in time for COVID, we like jokingly say. I recruited my partner, Barak, who had ample experience in building large-scale web systems. And it's interesting how almost immediately after we started the company, COVID hit and the world kind of went crazy. And I don't think at the beginning of 2020, anyone knew or even imagined how it's going to impact the supply chain industry as a whole. But, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that that's one of the industries that has been the most impacted by the last 2 years of the pandemic. I think so many fundamental assumptions that supply chain professionals have been using for, frankly, decades have just gone out the window. And it's just incredibly interesting to see how an industry that used to be, very unsexy, very gray in terms of the tech industry and VCs and such, all of a sudden became this really focal points. And there's so many new tech startups focused on logistics, focused on supply and demand, all these different things. It's just 3 years ago, who would have thought, right? That just was unimaginable.
Yeah, I can back up what you're saying because Vision started not long before the beginning of COVID, and it was a night and day change in terms of the priority I saw supply chain executives putting on their ability to leverage technology to, one, get visibility, two, make decisions. But it was a period where everyone's hair was on fire, and let's be honest, much of how supply chain functions is still manual activity, like you said. Logistics managers coming in and looking at spreadsheets and such, and needing teams of people to collect information if it's not in the ERP and such. So when you had something like COVID, which just completely interrupted workforces, all of a sudden supply chain executives, management, they were very blind about
Yes.
anything happening. And they also knew absolutely nothing was happening, but they didn't know where nothing was happening in their supply chain because everything was getting shut down. But another quick comment, I feel like a kindred spirit to you because I also have a product background, lifelong product manager at different tech companies. So I can very much relate to coming into this industry and seeing the opportunity for bringing some of like the best practices of how software functions and how you can build software into the supply chain space. Curious, at Unity, how do you keep a pulse on product today? What's your role in regards to the Unity product?
I think my head of product will probably argue that I'm over involved, and my CTO will probably agree. I think everyone will probably agree. I think as product managers, when we start companies, it's very hard to disengage from our product background and not run a company that's very product focused. And in fairness, I think it's a good thing. I do think that thinking in a productized way is something that hasn't been too common in supply chain software development in the past 20 years. Um, if you look at most of the big players in the industry, still heavily reliant on professional services as kind of a means to deliver value to customers. You look at implementation cycles, the length of them, 12 to 15 months. You look at the price points. You look at how custom solutions are. You look at, quite honestly, you talk to customers and you see what their expectations are like. It's very evident that they didn't evolve in an industry that's used to getting products that deliver clear, succinct, concise value to their customer in a reasonable amount of time, but rather more amorphous projects that end up involving to delivering some of the promised value ahead. And so I actually think that we should have more product people in the supply chain industry, and I think that's going to benefit a lot. Just to kind of start moving the entire industry away from custom solutions and into more repeatable products, clear value products that work together to achieve bigger value as well. And that's really going to be the next evolution for supply chain software in my mind. But obviously, I'm very biased.
Oh, no, no. I think both of you and I are very unbiased in making the recommendation that more product and product management experience would be valuable. I mean, simply from the perspective of that talent base doesn't really exist in supply chain management, logistics management yet. And it's a very discrete way of prioritizing and choosing where to put resources for the purposes of developing and deploying technology. And, fundamentally connects, the bits and bytes, the lines of code to the value it delivers the businesses who utilize that technology. And very distinct, use cases, case study type information. It also allows for a more agile approach, a more flexible approach. I was very much relating because we have different customers who have come from the space of their experiences engaging with large kind of enterprise services companies where there might be something in air quotes off the shelf, but it's so highly customized and it's wrapped up in professional services terms and packages that last years, because everything needs to be, one, so customized, but two, if there's ever any issue of some sort, there has to be some kind of like rapid response, rapid issue to update that customization. And which ends up requiring lots and lots and lots of people, and actually slows things down quite a bit, even though you feel like you're getting instant reaction. There's not this approach where with a product company and product offering that maximizes the most amount of value delivery for the most common elements across the most customers and partners. And so that you actually get more value delivered and distributed more quickly across a space than you do in the more services model. But this isn't product talk, I guess. This is shipping talk. But the reason we call the podcast "Full of Ship" is really this concept of there's a little bit of a gap between what the space thinks and knows about technology and the value that technology can bring, and we're trying to clear away any misconceptions. So on that note, and since we're speaking of products, there's a growing trend of startups in this space to focus on very specific problems, especially when you're building a product, right? Like you need a clear problem statement, as we say in the space. What's the pain that we resolve, cure, solve in some way? In the last number of years, with this kind of explosion of tech in the space, the different acronyms, TMS, WMS, ERP, mostly mega systems and a few players, where do you think our industry is going with this landscape of the traditional technology services enterprise offering and this bloom of product-focused technology startups? How is this playing out?
So I think, you laid out the map pretty accurately, right? The way the world looks like today in supply chain technology, for the most part, is a customer has a few huge monoliths of software that they probably implemented in very large, complicated implementation processes. They may or may not be connected to one another to a certain degree. For the most part, they're barely connected, or they were connected at one point, and the world has kind of moved on and the integration degraded over time. Not to speak of integrations with partners, third parties, carriers, all these different things. And that's what a typical supply chain company's IT landscape looks like. And then now you have, like you said, this explosion of software companies that are building products, right? And by a product, I mean a piece of software that solves a clear problem in a repeatable, clear way, where you can actually describe what the value proposition is. Now, granted, a lot of them solve much more than one problem. And for a lot of them, the product can be used to solve multiple different business problems for multiple different types of customers. But for me, one of the key things about a product is the repeatability, the repeatable nature of it, right? It's the same product. It's not custom. It's not a project. Maybe there is some work to implement it and configure it for the customer, and maybe there is some level of customization that's possible. But at the core of it, it's repeatable. It's the same thing. Like you said, it solved the same type of problem for different players in the industry. And we're really seeing a huge explosion of these types of companies solving in retail, solving last mile, solving visibility problems, solving demand prediction problems. It's like companies, supply chain by nature is such a massive, massive, massive industry. And it's comprised of so many different practices. Supply demand matching, that's a $1 trillion industry in and of itself. Logistics in itself includes shipping and warehousing and inventory. And so you can break it down into so many different places where you can build $1 billion company that I guess it's not that big of a surprise that you see so many different companies in supply chain because it's such a big space. And it's really incredibly cool for our customers where all of a sudden they went from not having any solutions available to them to having dozens of solutions available to them. One of the challenges, though, is that our customers can't be expected to move as quickly as we do, right? We, in the tech industry, we churn solutions and products out on a weekly basis, it seems. But our customers' purchase cycle is much slower than that. Not to mention, a lot of the companies that we expect to sell into are not accustomed to buying software as a means to solving specific problems. In part because historically, for them, buying software meant a 5-year agreement, spending millions of dollars with a long implementation cycle. And so their processes and their purchase processes and their culture is really geared towards I'll log into this website, swipe a credit card, do a free trial for 30 days, and then keep using it. There is no expense report article for software for most supply chain organizations. And so there's what we're seeing now is that there's a certain misalignment or impedance mismatch between tech companies and the way tech companies want to do business and supply chain companies and the way supply chain companies approach solving their problems. But I will say that the supply chain companies are getting better and better and better at this. It's like you can literally see the difference, and I'm sure you guys have seen it as well. You know, if you look 3 years into the past, right, pre-COVID and now, their ability to adopt new solutions has just gone through the roof. Processes are faster, their understanding is better. Now, obviously, again, huge industry, so you have all types of customers. You have the customers that know exactly what they want and they're fairly technically savvy, and there's customers that are still, pen and paper, and they do and they do everything over, maybe even snail mail, mostly email. And so I think what we're going to see over time in the next few years is kind of these different views kind of consolidating into something that actually works. And, the industry will kind of change the way it buys software, and the software companies is going to, we're going to figure out how to sell software into this market segment, which is probably going to be different than, DevOps or security or these kinds of solutions. But we're going to find a new normal, a new way of doing things, like a new process. And that, in my mind, is going to spark a whole new era of adopting products to solve problems in supply chain, because all of a sudden they'll figure out, oh, there's a way to solve this problem that doesn't entail working 3 more hours a day or hiring 20 more people, which has sadly kind of been the solution for a lot of supply chain problems up until now, because there was no product. Your only alternative was go pay $5 million and buy this massive thing that may or may not in 12 months solve the problem that you have right now. I really think we're going to start seeing that shift happen. And one of the things we're seeing with Unity being more of an infrastructure play for supply chain data is, while these new products are much better at offering APIs and being much better at taking data in, taking data out, someone still needs to connect all these things to one another. Otherwise, it's still a ton of just point-to-point integrations. And we're strong believers that over the next few years, along with the rise of all of these productized solutions for supply chain, there's also going to be a rise of the need to figure out, okay, what does the data plane look like for supply chain data? And unfortunately, now it looks like Excel.
Yeah, and you used the word consolidation. Kind of curious. In my mind's eye, when you say that, I see that there are phases and steps in that happening. Mm-hmm. I could see one element of that being, well, if you have all of these product companies emerging that solve very discrete problem sets or address very discrete problem sets, you have all these legacy companies that have the more enterprise, highly customized legacy solutions in some sense, you might be able to say. It also, you have the more Unity based, like the network, the web, the laying the data pipelines foundation. How, and maybe there's other parties involved. I mean, I'm thinking of companies like, I remember, you look at companies more like a Project 44 or a 4Kites, a GT Nexus, if you want to get a little more legacy, maybe like a CargoWise, Mercury Gate. These players that I don't want to say are like legacy, but they're also not necessarily product companies either. There's something kind of in between the two. How do you see this consolidation happening over time, or this network of specialization meeting customized solutions, meeting an emergence of offerings that, standardized sizes fit many, but not all.
So I think we've always had what I like to call portfolio companies in the supply chain industry, right? If you think about it, Oracle is kind of a portfolio company. They have a pretty big portfolio of products, and they try to get you in as many of them as possible. And their way of giving you a solution using all these different products is with professional services, right? Like they figure out how to tie all these products together, and they send an army of people that connect it for your purposes. And if you want to look at slightly newer companies, look at Blue Yonder. Again, very much in my mind, a portfolio company. They have solutions ranging from container tracking to planning and predictions and machine learning, right? But at the end of the day, the way they got there is by buying a lot of solutions. And because the solutions historically haven't been highly, interoperable by nature, when you have a portfolio of these types of solutions, you still need the professional services, factor to kind of tie them all together to provide value for a customer. What I think is going to happen is we're still going to see, like in a lot of other industries, we're still going to see very large portfolio companies, but now they're going to start acquiring or working with product companies, like these new age modern product companies. And you see this, like you see Project 44 went on, I wouldn't say an acquisition spree, but did a bunch of acquisitions, right? And so they've been growing their product offering by absorbing the technology and capabilities of other companies. And I think we're going to start seeing more and more of that. And some of it is going to take the form of acquisitions, and some of it is going to take the form of partnerships, right? And that's going to become possible through the product nature of what these companies are offering, right? A very clear value proposition, ideally with very stable, very succinct integration methods and interoperability methods. So, the APIs, the standards, all of these different things. And so it's going to become much easier for these portfolio companies to put together solutions for their customers, right? Because the fundamental building blocks of the solutions are going to become much better in nature and much more connectable to one another. The synergies are just going to be much easier to produce than they used to be. But I think there's still going to be consolidation like in any other industry.
Well, as these companies start getting closer, either organically through partnerships or maybe more a little inorganically through acquisitions, etc., there's going to be the challenge these companies face. And how do you actually stitch all of the tech and the software together, the behind the scenes, to make it work from the customer's perspective seamlessly? So this starts to bring up the topic of APIs, the importance of interoperability, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of like specific solutions, how well they've been able to work together, how much value has been brought to the market through interoperability or another approach if that exists, and maybe tell us a little bit about how are end customers looking to manage their supply chains and benefit from interoperability.
Yeah. So one of the things, and this is especially true for logistics, is that something that exists now that hasn't existed before is access to, and obviously I'm very biased towards a very data-focused view of the world. And so there are certain data sets that were just incredibly difficult to achieve before. Container tracking data, right? To point out an obvious one. 5 years ago, if you wanted to be able to track containers, you had to go and do direct integrations with every carrier you might work with. And if tomorrow your freight forwarder shipped with a different carrier, too bad. You're not going to be able to get the data on where it is. Now you have companies like Vision that you can just plug into a single API that's well documented. The milestones are normalized. You don't need to know much about who's actually doing the shipping in the back end to get access to this data sets. And that's true for a lot of other types of data sets, right? Shipping schedules, shipping schedule changes, skipped ports, all of these different things, right? All these things are all of a sudden available through all kinds of aggregators that provide you those types of data sets. The challenge we've seen, and that's just unprecedented from a supply chain industry standpoint. The challenge we've seen is that most of the end consumers for this data just don't know what to do with what we call data sources, right? Like they get an API, they don't have developers on staff that can build the custom integrations into their TMS. But at the end of the day, they want to see all the pertinent data for their supply chain operation in one place. Like everyone's dream is still that single pane of glass where they look and they see their orders and their inventory and their shipments all in one place. You click on a shipment, you see what's in it, you click on what's in it, you see the order that produced it, you see the status, all very contextual. And while the access to the data has become so much better over the last few years, it's still very much disparate data sets. And so if you have, inventory data coming through one channel and shipping data coming through another channel and order management data coming through a third channel, there's still the fairly heavy lift of synchronizing and normalizing and organizing all of that the information into one succinct picture. And I think that's going to be the next big, and that's one of the things we're really focused on at Unity, right? Like how do you get data from disparate sources into one coherent view that you can use and you can consume as a user? Because if all we do is just get all the data in one place, but there's no way to tie it together, we didn't do that much, right? It's like someone still needs to go in and fix all these different pieces of information. But the holy grail hasn't really changed in 10 years, right? It's like end-to-end supply chain visibility, being able to predict what's going to happen. And it's all, the foundation for all of that is really, good data, right? Good data leads to good visibility, then leads to predictions. Like all these good things that's been happening in other industries are, I think, at our doorstep if we can just figure out this, how to connect all these different solutions that solve different pieces and how to streamline the information and coherently.
So what do you think our listeners need to know about the differences and the impact on their businesses between a network of EDI connections and a network of API connections?
EDI, everyone's favorite topic. I find that one of the key differentiators between a network of APIs and a network of EDI connections is really core to what we talked about earlier with product. And that's, to me, one of the foundational things a product-led approach to supply chain software development is really important. EDI is essentially a series of custom, non-reusable integrations that are point-to-point. Okay, it's very much a relic of the age where it was created, where that was the way the industry behaved. Everything was a project and implementation, mostly between one company and another. Whereas APIs focus on repeatability, focus on delivering clear, succinct value in a very reusable way and to a degree, self-service approach, right? I have an API. If you have the documentation, you can consume data or push data into it and get value out of the API without me having to work with you in a dedicated way. And it's a much more scalable, much more repeatable way of doing business, right? It's much less about me as a company having direct integrations with every business partner I work with, and much more around having a whole network of resources and assets that I can have access to via API to achieve different business goals. APIs for shipping, APIs for track and trace, APIs for finding inventory, API. All of a sudden, I don't depend on anyone else, agreeing to my EDI specification to get value out of a relationship, right? Like there's value to be had by every company in a much more scalable way. And once that hits a certain, that API economy in supply chain to a degree hits a certain mass, critical mass, you're going to start seeing companies, and you, to a degree, you already see all these new age direct-to-consumer companies that kind of behave like that, right? They manage to get a really fast scale because they essentially have, an API to shipping and an API to third-party logistics and an API to contract manufacturing. They don't do anything. They're just the hub of the business, right? Like they're a design company and they employ other units of value through some kind of contract. Well, programmatically, that's an API. We're not far from the day where you can just set up a whole supply chain business just through APIs. That would be crazy.
So in this transition we're seeing from the services mindset to the product mindset, what is a supply chain executive or procurement officer, a decision maker, I'd say a cargo owner or a logistics services company, what should they make of all this? Like, how should they be planning for their future, recognizing that this is a change that appears to be happening?
So I actually want to tie it into another very large trend that we're seeing in the industry we actually, about a year ago, one of our big customers pointed out to us. We were presenting Unity to them, and one of the directors in the room turned to the chief supply chain officer, and she told him, "You realize that if we do this, we'll need to hire a whole different kind of professionals into our business." And he told her, "You're wrong. We already need to hire a completely different type of talent into our industry." And I think that was the first time someone really shined a spotlight on something that we see a lot of our customers facing right now. There's a shift in the workforce in supply chain, and people going into this industry now don't want to copy paste things from the web into a spreadsheet 15 times a day and then send it and then come in the next day and do the same thing again and again and again. They expect, and rightfully so, to have data available at their fingertips, and that data to deal with insight, not raw data. They expect not to be typists. They expect to be knowledge workers. And I think or rather I would say, there's a whole set of infrastructure, organizational, process, cultural, technological, that needs to be put in place for that transition to happen. So the companies that will win 10 years from now are going to be ones that embrace this change rather than stick to the old way of doing business. And we see this in COVID even, right? Like the rate at which companies were able to adapt to the changing world of operations for post-COVID or mid-COVID really changed how successful they were afterwards. And so I think the supply chain leaders need to ask themselves, is this solution I'm looking into more of the same? Does it increase the investment I already have to a degree of sunk cost in the old generation of system? Like, am I putting in maybe more EDI integrations in place that I'm not going to be able to reuse, and my future users are not going to be able to reuse themselves? Or am I setting up this infrastructure of the way, the future data-driven operations is going to take place, right? Like, am I putting in scalable infrastructure that will allow me to get added value? Do I know, and much more tactically, do I know what value I'm getting, right? Am I buying this amorphous solution platform that's going to give me all kinds of random things? Or can I literally say in 3 weeks, how is my life going to be different? And these are, I think, for a lot of our buyers, just fundamentally different questions to ask than they've been asking so far.
For those buyers, what are the buyers going to need to learn for themselves so that they can create organizations that will enable this new workforce, unblock them, be able to gain all the value, access all the value that transition that they're choosing to make promises to deliver? What education do the buyers need to start building?
That's a really good question. And I think that's a question that doesn't get asked nearly often enough. Buyers need to look around and see how their work patterns have changed on other fronts, right? The way they communicate, it's changed. Went from phones to emails to WhatsApp in a lot of cases, and other like immediate communication styles. How their collaboration changed post COVID with Teams instead of going into meetings, how people are now working remote. They need to understand that those fundamental changes in business processes also apply to their supply chain operations side. And they need to ask themselves, what are the parts of a data-driven operation that I'm just not familiar with? Because a lot of them aren't necessarily, data operations savvy, right? Maybe they came up in an organization that was fairly, manually driven, but they need to get familiar with the fundamentals of, working based on KPIs rather than, reacting to very transactional pieces. Understanding, I don't want to say basic statistics, but understanding like what does it mean to make a decision based on actual data rather than everything we've seen in the past and the gut feel of the most experienced person in the room, right? What having the information and the access to it actually enables you, right? And they need to rethink, if I had access to all this data, what would I do differently? Like, how would I run my operation differently if information was easily available to everyone at any point in time? What would be different? What would the process be different? What kind of people would I hire? I think that's the kind of questions and the kind of education that supply chain leaders need to start focusing on.
So I always like to wrap up with people's predictions of the future. Where do you think the industry is going to be a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What will life look like for the buyers? What will they have implemented? What will life look like for the product companies, the portfolio companies you mentioned? Just how do you see the future? What's your vision?
Well, good thing this is recorded so I can eat my hat 10 years from now. I think there's a few parts to it. One, I think from the supply chain companies, the actual operational companies, 5 or 10 years from now, they're going to look back and ask themselves, how the heck did we use to run operations before all these things were available? I think a lot of the things that are now like cutting edge innovation in supply chain, in other industries that have had them for 10 years, they seem obvious, right? It's like some things are just, you go on the web, you go into Google and you say what you want and you get all the websites. 20 years ago, that was basically science fiction, right? It's easy to forget how quickly things change and how quickly we get used to them. So I think from the customer's point of view, their day-to-day is just going to be completely different. It's going to be much more streamlined, much more data focused. Everything's going to be much more available. There's going to be tools that automate a lot of the things that are manual today. I think what we'll see is supply chain workers becoming knowledge workers, really, like leveraging data. There's talks about the rise of the citizen developer. We're not quite there yet. I think we have a bit of more evolution to go through, but I think that's in the cards, right? That's going to happen in supply chain too. For the supply chain technology companies, what I think will happen is that we'll start seeing new, dare I say, SAPs, right? There's going to be some obvious huge winners, and they're going to evolve to become portfolio companies because they'll grow initially organically, and then they'll grow and buy other companies. And their ability to scale, will be highly accelerated by buying companies with good interoperability, right? Like if you buy good API first companies, your ability to connect them to one another to produce even more value is significantly higher. And so I think the new age of portfolio companies are going to be much more agile, much faster, and much better at delivering clear value to customers fast than the older generation. Having said that, I don't think the older generation companies are going anywhere. I think, SAP and Oracle and Blue Yonder are here to stay. They offer really good value for a very big segment of the industry. And more importantly, they know how to deliver the value to that segment of the industry. So I wouldn't write them off very quickly. Plus, my assumption is they're going to buy a lot of these startups, right? They're going to end up buying a lot of companies. and hopefully make their products and their portfolios much better through buying, pure product companies. So I think everyone's going to benefit from it, either through acquisitions or through organic growth. But at the end of the day, the people benefiting the most are going to be what I jokingly called earlier, the people actually doing the work, whose days are, look, supply chain operations is a really hard job. And I think at least some of it is unnecessarily hard. Like, there's solutions out there. You guys offer a great solution, I think. We try to as well. I think we can make their lives really, really better. We can make them much more effective. We can make them happier in their day-to-day lives. And that's very much a worthwhile effort.
Well, Amir, on behalf of our audience and of course myself, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your perspective, share your unique experiences, and what I think is a very valuable view of how this industry is developing. This has been another episode of Full of Ship. I'm your host, Kyle Henderson, and our guest today was Amir Taichman, CEO of Unity SCM. See you here next time. Thank you all.
Thank you for joining Kyle and his guest on the Full of Ship podcast. Be sure to subscribe and tune in next time as Kyle continues to demystify ocean carrier tracking with his future guests.